Well, thank you very much for that kind introduction. I've been studying Ethiopia for years and years now, longer than I care to say. And for most of those years, when I've told someone I'm off to Ethiopia, they've said, "Poor you, make sure you take your sandwiches with you," as though I was liable to die of starvation. So it's rather a surprise, and a very welcome surprise, to find myself talking about Ethiopia as one of the current African success stories. It is, as you'll see from the map, surrounded by rather difficult parts of Africa. Somalia, which is a byword for state collapse. South Sudan, which is doing the same. Eritrea, which has been described as an African North Korea. And in some ways, it's all the more surprising to find a success story in such an unlikely part of the world. I should say straight off that the title, Ethiopia, Africa's China, without the question mark, is taken from an Ethiopian government publication and should correspondingly be treated with a certain amount of caution. But certainly over the last 10 to 15 years, something quite extraordinary has been happening there. For the period from 2000 up to 2013, the World Bank, as a tolerably neutral judge, ranks Ethiopia as the second fastest growing economy in Africa, second only to Angola, and equal with Equatorial Guinea. Both of those, of course, are petrostates and highly susceptible to changes in global oil prices. In 2015, the World Bank again, with the collapse of the great commodity boom, now ranks Ethiopia with annual growth at 9.6% a year as the highest in Africa and indeed the second highest in the world. And again, the strange thing about this is that it has not been due to having a lucky commodity with a price going through the roof, be it oil or copper or iron ore or diamonds. Ethiopia has very little by way of mineral resources. Even today, 80% of its exports are agricultural produce. The traditional one has always been coffee, which originates in Ethiopia. It still grows wild there in the southwest, together with new ones such as cut flowers. And it has spectacularly outperformed other African economies with roughly the same product mix that it has. Now, you always need to be dead suspicious about statistics, I'm sure you are, and about African statistics in particular. But this is something you can actually see happening on the ground. I get back there usually a couple of times a year, and every time I find myself in previously familiar parts of Addis Ababa, simply not knowing quite where I am. But it isn't just the building boom in Addis Ababa, or the main cities, or indeed the economic powerhouse of Ethiopia tends to be down along the line of rail from Addis Ababa to the port at Djibouti. It's something you can see happening throughout the country. Late last year, I was flying over the superb mountainous region of Ethiopia with my nose pressed to the panel of the window pane of the aeroplane, and what you really noticed was the sun shining off bright new corrugated iron roofs way, way out into the countryside, miles away from the nearest road. I have a friend who was doing a study, an anthropologist, of a place along this road here, no, that road there actually, and he found a place where a soldier on leaving the army had put his bounty into opening a cafe. And so trucks started stopping at the cafe. So a petrol station put itself there to take advantage of the trucks. And over a period of 10 years, what had been an isolated bunabet, as they call them, or cafe beside the road, had developed into a flourishing small town. And even more remarkable, he found that the attitude of the people there was changing too. From being a traditionally deeply conservative peasantry, they were becoming interested in change, in education, in markets, in a way that had never previously happened. So you can say, beyond the statistics, that this is really happening. So the big questions are, first, how has this happened? And second, how can it be sustained? And the place to start is with a phenomenon all too rare in Africa, a government with a real commitment to economic development. All the more surprising in many ways in that the present Ethiopian government, which has now been in power for 25 years, started off as a classic Marxist guerrilla movement up in the mountains in the north, of the kind that normally, when these guys come to power, they think in terms of a centrally planned economy on the Soviet model or something like that, of the sort that has been a spectacular disaster everywhere that it has been attempted. And certainly there were brains behind this, and principally the first leader of the present Ethiopian government from 1991 through until he died 4 years ago in 2012, a man called Meles Zenawi, who had a very rare ability to think outside the box, to look around the world for models of development that he thought might be useful to Ethiopia, then think about how to apply them to the particular circumstances of his own country, and, most unusual of all, when things went wrong, to think again and change them. I once asked him back in the early days about his agricultural development policy, which I thought was a bit dodgy, and he said, I asked, is it going to work? And he said, I don't know. We thought we'd give it a go. If it doesn't work, we'll try something else. A kind of attitude all too rare among national leaders of all kinds, and not least in Africa. Some of you may have met Nick Stern, Lord Stern, to be given his due, who was chief economist of the World Bank and is now a professor in the London School of Economics, who told me once that he had co-authored professional papers in economics with 4 Nobel Prize winners. And in that company, he said, Meles is bright. Just a man of outstanding intelligence. And that's what you need, certainly, to start. He rapidly sussed out that the only way to develop in the modern world was by integrating yourself into the global economy, rejecting the all-too common tendency of communist leaders or guerrilla party leaders come to power to go for socialist development in one country, and look to global markets instead. At the same time, he roundly rejected the policies being put forward by most of the international financial institutions and aid donors, with their emphasis on liberal economic policies and the free market, what is sometimes referred to as the Washington Consensus, and went instead for an East Asian model based on places such as Taiwan or South Korea, and of course the really big one, China. And these, as you'll know, emphasize the role of the state in providing basic infrastructure, and initially at least a fairly heavy guiding hand in running the economy, while looking to the private sector as the essential engine for long-term economic growth. Now, certainly like the People's Republic of China, and like also Korea and Taiwan in their early days, it is important to note that Ethiopia is not a democratic state. It may call itself the People's Federal Democratic Republic, but not in any sense that one would recognise as democratic in the West. It is essentially a one-party state. Its government structure is built on communist single-party lines, and when faced by serious opposition, its instinct is just to smash it. There's no gainsaying that. At the same time, there is something to be said for a single-party government, provided, of course, that it follows the right policies, which in Africa has very, very seldom been the case. It does enable the government to avoid raising expensive expectations in order to buy votes, which has been the classic problem of Africa's democracies, and to concentrate instead, at any rate in the early period, on putting capital into investment. It is also a country, it has to be said, with a deeply rooted authoritarian tradition, in which it's actually very hard to express public disagreement with the people in power without being suspected of treason. It's a country that in its 2,000 years of existence has never been democratic yet, and my guess is that you're likely to die waiting if you expect that to happen in the near future. But what have they actually done? The first and key emphasis has been on infrastructure, and within that, communications and in particular roads. Much of it, especially in the north, is extremely mountainous and travel is correspondingly difficult. You can wind your way up and down, endless hairpin bends, going down into a great gorge and up again on the other side. And simply getting the goods to market or getting the goods from outside into domestic markets has been one of its major problems. So that was the first thing to pick, and on the government's figures, just over the 10 years or a bit more since 2004 to 2013, the road network has more than doubled from about 35,000 kilometres to 85,000 kilometres. And that again is a change that you can see actually there on the ground. And for those like myself who still remember the very few and dusty roads of the 1960s, it's quite miraculous. The old single track, single carriageway railway from Djibouti, all the way there from the port up to Addis Ababa, has just been modernised into a dual track standard gauge railway, which I think was due to come into operation either today or yesterday, just on the very point of it. And given that all virtually of Ethiopia's imports and exports, the bulk ones, have to come through the port of Djibouti, that should make a massive difference simply to the capacity to get things in and get things out. At present, or certainly up until the coming into effect of the new railway, there was just this endless line of big lorries with trucks grinding their way up the 6,000 feet incline from the port of Djibouti to Addis Ababa in one long continuous walking pace smoke belching trail. And the railway should cut the journey time from about 3 days to about 12 hours, and the level of pollution something quite dramatically. There are also projects underway to extend the rail network to other parts of the country, notably down into the south there, and even up into the north to Mekelle there. Actually, I'm a bit more sceptical about whether that is really a viable use of scarce capital, but with boundless self-confidence, certainly they're going ahead. Addis Ababa, since earlier this year, is now the only city in Africa to have its metro or tube line. 2 lines only so far. That one goes from the north of the city to the south and another from the east to the west. And to judge from when I was there 2-3 months ago, the tube trains are absolutely packed from end to end. It seems to have been a great success. So transport was the first thing. Electricity has also been a problem, not least because of the projected increase in industry, which is likely to use a lot of it. And in a country which describes itself as the water tower of Africa, the obvious way to go is hydro. And there have been a series of dams on the Gibi River here that goes down into Lake Rudolph on the Kenya-Ethiopia border, and a really big one, grandly known as the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam, right up against the Sudanese border on the Blue Nile River, which is now in an advanced stage of construction and should, in principle, start generating next year. That depends a fair bit on what the rains are like, and is by some way the largest hydro electric scheme in Africa, and ranks amongst the larger ones in the world. Big dams, of course, are classic, what they call in the jargon, high modernist projects. They're a wonderful way of projecting a sense of power and purpose and development, which all too often fail to live up to their billing as the answer to all of the country's problems. And we've seen that, for instance, on the same river with the Aswan High Dam in Egypt, with the Merowe Dam in Sudan, as well as in places like the Three Gorges Dam in China. Though you can say for the Grand Ethiopian Dam that it makes a lot more sense to put a dam upstream there in relatively mountainous country rather than way down in Egypt and Sudan, low-lying, so you need a lot of dam for a relatively shallow depth, and exposed to a massive level of evaporation in one of the hottest deserts in the world. That dam is solely for hydroelectricity, is simply too close to the Sudanese border for the Ethiopians at any rate to use it for irrigated agriculture, though the Sudanese have their eye on projects a bit further downstream, which inevitably makes the Egyptians extremely worried. In principle, at any rate, the electricity one they should crack. Telecoms are more problematic, not least because the government insists on running them under its own control, because it is a massive cash cow generating enormous amounts of money for the government's domestic investment projects. And the result is that they're both less efficient and considerably more expensive, say, than in Kenya, where they have been entirely privatised. Or even, actually, telecoms are more efficient in Somalia, which doesn't have a government at all. But the telecoms companies run their own business with, and nobody disturbs it, because the Somalis, I think, must be the most talkative people in the entire world, and if you cut them off their mobile phones, there would be complete and utter mayhem. I keep trying to persuade the Ethiopians that if they privatised the telecoms, they could actually make more money out of the massively increased level of traffic that there'd be, with greater reliability and lower price, but they're not buying that one. The other major areas of investment are in health, where they've seen very significant gains in areas such as infant mortality, and in education, with in particular a massive expansion in universities. Many of them, it has to be said, pretty low quality universities, though there are one or two quite good ones. The key to all this is efficient top-down government machinery. There are advantages in having been an autocratic state over a very long time. Ethiopians generally obey orders, and provided that the folks at the top are clear enough about what they want to do and how they're going to do it, broadly speaking, the folks at the bottom will actually do it. A key example of that has been that Ethiopia has by a long way the most efficient and successful airline in Africa. Ethiopian Airlines, now I think in its 60th glorious year, which has simply taken over as the major internal carrier in Africa from others such as South African or Kenyan airlines, which are nothing like so efficiently run. The problem with top-down efficiency, if you like, a kind of militarised system, is that Ethiopians can be maddeningly obstructive when it comes to anything requiring initiative, compromise, or even, you're sometimes tempted to think, straightforward common sense. Dealing with an Ethiopian bureaucrat who hasn't had his orders can be just infuriating. But to go on from there, how do they pay for all this? They certainly don't get it out of balance of payment surpluses like the oil extracting states. They have a massive deficit, with imports running, can you believe it, in sort of merchandise imports at 5 or 6 times the level of merchandise exports, which anyone will recognise as a problem. The trade gap for the first quarter of 2016 was $3.6 billion US. So that leaves them very heavily dependent on capital inflows, which are justified on the basis that all this investment means spending up front in order to create the conditions for later growth, but puts them in hock to whoever is providing the investment. A lot of this comes as concessional finance, either as aid or as cheap loans. Ethiopia boxes and coxes with Pakistan as the two major recipients of British development aid, for instance. It's quite extraordinary when so much development aid goes into Africa that the largest British recipient of British aid should be a country which isn't even part of the Commonwealth. You'd have thought that historic links might take precedence, but not so. And when you ask why it is that so much money goes to a frankly undemocratic country with a pretty poor human rights record, and I'll be saying something later about Ethiopia's particular political problems, that in addition fails to follow the approved Western development model, the answer you get when you ask the folks who are handing out the money is that this is, on the whole, money well spent. If you pay for a road, you get a road. If you pay for a clinic, you get a clinic. And in all too many of the countries to which DFID, the aid ministry, dishes out its cash, that just is not the case. But beyond that, what appeals to donors is precisely the fact that Ethiopia has its own development model. It has a sense of ownership, of commitment, that, again, is all too rare elsewhere. And DFID officials would explain to you the frustrations of going to some African country and being asked, what do we have to do in order to get the money? Ethiopia is not like that at all. They say, this is what we want to do, A, B, C, D, and on the whole, they get it. There's actually a huge gap between the rhetoric of aid donors about support for democracy and human rights and good governance and all this, and what they actually do with the cash, which is much more a matter of where you spend it. It has to be said, too, that donor enthusiasm for democracy has taken a big knock, especially from the Arab Spring, which put right a lot of people's misconceptions about what outsiders can do to create democracy in the developing world, and also, sadly, the pretty steady decline in the quality of democracy in those multi-party states in Africa which pretend to be democratic. Places such as Kenya, say, or Uganda, or Zambia. The latest Zambian elections earlier this year were just spectacularly and obviously rigged. And the first person up there to congratulate the re-elected president who'd rigged the elections was, can you guess it, the British High Commissioner. Democracy has died pretty well as a key element in, at any rate, UK policy towards Africa and elsewhere, and I think for many of the other owners as well. The big provider of concessional finance is China, which is now, as for many African states, Ethiopia's principal trading partner, and isn't going to have too many problems about democracy and human rights, but has provided a lot of cash, especially for transport infrastructure, including notably the renewed railway line from Djibouti to Addis Ababa and the new Addis Ababa metro system. And that is worth looking at because usually the big centres for Chinese engagement in Africa are in places where they're looking for specific minerals in particular, which are needed to fuel the great Chinese boom in manufacturing. That just doesn't go for Ethiopia. And therefore can't explain the level of its commitments, which are probably better accounted for in political and strategic terms. Ethiopia is the second most populous state in Africa after Nigeria, with a population now probably of about 100 million. It lies, as you can see, in a strategically very sensitive part of Africa, immediately adjacent to the key shipping lanes through the Gulf of Aden, through the Red Sea and up through the Suez Canal. It is also now unquestionably the diplomatic capital of Africa. Not only the headquarters of the African Union are in Addis Ababa, and again, the Chinese built the glossy new headquarters building as a gift from the Chinese people to the people of Africa, which gives them a high diplomatic profile, but a very large number of other international organisations, both global and African, likewise congregate. You get a classic concentration effect. If some major institutions are there already, it makes sense for other ones to join them. This does mean, of course, that the whole Ethiopian economic miracle is liable to come to a juddering halt if outside funders turn off the tap. And that's obviously the case, and all I can say is that there's no sign of it happening yet, and no specific evident threat beyond upheavals in the global economy, which you will be much better placed to assess than I can. On the whole, funding agencies are happy to have something that can be touted as an African success story, even one that does not correspond to their own preferred political and economic models, and equally for any global power with an interest in world stability. This is very obviously a centre of potential major instability, and have a big, stable, economically successful state at the centre of that region is something that matters an awful lot more than specific things such as the quality of human rights observance. Even so, that leaves the government desperately looking for cash. One of the effects of that is a squeeze on domestic sources of credits. Telecoms is one classic example of that. You have to pay much more for these than they're worth, so that the government can pocket the cash and put them, you hope anyhow, into its road building or health programs. Another one is that domestic bank deposits in Ethiopia are subject to a kind of hidden government levy due to the fact that banks have to place a given percentage of their deposits, I think it's 40%, in government bonds, which are essentially forced loans to the state at a level of rate of interest, well, rates of interest aren't anything these days, but a rate of interest significantly less than the domestic rate of inflation. Another place to look is remittances from the large Ethiopian diaspora. There are millions of Ethiopians now in the United States, quite a number in Europe, a lot in the Gulf, and on the latest figures I can find, these are sending back something like $2.5 to $3 billion a year. A lot of that goes straight back to family members, which you can easily argue is the best thing to do with them, because that goes straight into the domestic consumption market and helps to boost the economy as a whole. But the key one that the government is looking for is foreign direct investment, which they need not just to provide the capital, but of course to create the productive base on which the whole project ultimately depends. This has increased quite sharply, but is still a good deal less than what they'd want. According to the latest figures I can find from UNCTAD, in 2013, it was coming to a bit under $1 billion a year, which is still, well, it's very welcome money, but only makes a relatively small dent in both the balance of payments deficit and the creation of the level of productive industry that they're looking for. Overwhelmingly, it comes from Asia, but from all over Asia, everywhere from Turkey to Japan. The Turks have put a lot of money into textiles, Chinese into shoe manufacturing, a number of states, including Saudi Arabia and Japan, into agricultural development projects. So there's a certain amount of spread there. One fairly important success has been floriculture, growing flowers, where, as you'd expect, the Dutch have been fairly prominent. You know, the Dutch are just the world's experts on flowers. They love them. And an awful lot gets exported from the flower farms south of Addis Ababa straight off to the great global flower market in Amsterdam. A number of large agricultural concessions seem to have run into the kinds of problems that large agricultural concessions usually run into all over the world, and not least in Africa. Back in the late 2000s, there was a global scare about shortage of agricultural land to buy food, and so a lot of companies, again from Japan to Saudi Arabia, took options on areas of especially southwestern Ethiopia, most of them down there, at very low cost, simply in order to have a piece of territory that they might be able to use. But the moment they actually got down there, the infrastructure costs of developing this and many of the technical issues over soils and rainfall and whatever meant that actually they'd bought a dud, but they weren't paying much for it. A lot of the Ethiopian economy is still essentially public sector driven, and in addition to a fairly heavy-handed regulatory role and infrastructural involvement, the state still plays a significant role in the productive economy. The major official state corporation is called METEC, the Metals and Engineering Corporation, which started off under the old communist regime before 1991 as the government's arms manufacturer, and they needed an awful lot of arms and still more ammunition in those days, but has since developed into a general technical engineering facility that has done much of the construction of locomotives and carriages for the new metro system in Addis Ababa, for instance. It also provides handy retirement jobs for military engineers when they're not up to working at the front any longer, and generally, as African state corporations go, is relatively efficient, but a state corporation nonetheless. The state also retains some interests in commercial agriculture, especially sugar, and there have been monster sugar plantations set up down in this area, and from what I hear, they've been a considerable disappointment, again, like many large-scale state-run agricultural development projects. For my money, they could probably do with privatisation, but I don't know whether any private sugar investors have been there to look at what it would involve and whether they could make money out of it. One peculiarity, not confined to Ethiopia, is what is sometimes referred to in the jargon as party staples. That is to say, companies run by the ruling party, which technically are private corporations, but of course have an inside political track, which is likely to account for much of their success. The most prominent of these in Ethiopia is called EFFORT, the Endowment Fund for Tigray. Tigray is the area right up in the north of the country there, which is where the guerrilla movement that seized power in 1991 came from, and many of whose members are still prominent in government. And this is a classic conglomerate. It has a bank, a transport company, a cement factory, a construction business, agro-processing, you name it, and there'll be an EFFORT subsidiary running it. And for some time, even more tellingly, this whole enterprise was run by the former Prime Minister's wife. But on the other hand, the state and party-state corporations are still only a pretty limited share of the total economy. There is a genuine private sector that operates beyond that. As often happens in developing countries, almost invariably in fact, the domestic private sector has been, or the management of it, has been heavily concentrated in particular segments of indigenous society. Throughout this area of Africa, even Christian areas, where you will find a little shop, it's almost bound to be run by Muslims. Islamic trading networks spread from the coast, and there's a very long history of trade, of course, not only from the coast up the Red Sea into Arabia, but equally out into the Gulf and across to India, and concentrated too in specific ethnic groups within the population, of which the most evident are a group called the Gurage, who are about half Christian, half Muslim. But scratch an Ethiopian businessman, and either he's a Tigrayan with government contacts, or he'll be a Kuragi. But that's pretty much par for the course in many parts of the developing world. One notable failure of the government, in my view, is that it has not done much to promote domestic private sector investment. Unlike, say, Korea or Japan, you don't find real Ethiopian shaibals or mega corporations, and it may be that the Marxist origins of the government lead it still to take a pretty wary eye on domestic businesses, which they see potentially at least as a source of political opposition. And that has meant that they have looked heavily for international investment, FDI, as a source of the capital that they need. Look at the global tables, and Ethiopia doesn't rank as high as you might expect, or as anyone supporting Ethiopian growth would want, in the various global indices, such as the Ease of Doing Business Index or the Global Entrepreneurial Index, with which I'm sure that any of you here who are concerned about investment will be very much aware of. In the latest Ease of Doing Business Index, worldwide it ranks 146th out of 189, which is nothing great. Among African states who occupy virtually the whole of the bottom of that index, it ranks 19th, with another 28 below it. It's pretty much the same story with the Global Entrepreneurship Index, where it ranks 114th out of 132, though again higher than the average in Africa. So in broad rankings, you'd have to say anyone used to doing business in Africa is going to be used to what they call a challenging business environment, and within that environment, Ethiopia's a bit better than most, but nothing special. Equally, it's well worth looking at the breakdown of individual elements within each of those indices, because Ethiopia comes out very well on some and much, much worse on others. And what it comes out well on is things that the government can fix. What it comes out worse on is broader social indicators, which are much harder for the government to manage. Looking then at the challenges to economic growth in Ethiopia, the big one on the economic side is making the transition from essentially state-led growth, which is what we've had so far, to a private sector-led economy. And Ethiopians, as I've suggested, are generally very good at doing what they do, which is top-down control and essentially technical tasks. If there are any engineers here, and there are bound to be, I hope they won't be too offended if I say that they take a classically engineering approach to economic issues, a matter of identifying specific problems to which you then look for technical solutions. And the current Prime Minister, Haile Mariam Desalegn, is himself an engineer, a hydrological engineer. In the new universities that are sprouting up all over the place, they're insisting on a very high proportion of the students studying engineering. And it is a classic view, of which the extreme example was the old Soviet economy, that by getting enough engineers, you can get the economy right. When you get down to looking at how economic development actually works, an awful lot more depends on human factors, on entrepreneurial ability, on risk-taking, on judgment, on a capacity to organise people collaboratively rather than just give them orders from the top down. That's where Ethiopians on the whole tend to be much less good. They're almost instinctively uncomfortable with policy space, with giving people initiatives, with saying, OK, you go off and do this the way you think is right. They're much happier with close control. At the leadership level, certainly they are deeply aware of the need for private capital and conscious of the need to create the conditions under which businesses flourish. If any of you here are going off to Ethiopia with ideas of investment in mind, the chap you're likely to find across the desk is a man called Akabe Okubai, who is the Prime Minister's chief advisor on industry and investment, just a very, very smart guy indeed, who recently completed a really excellent PhD at the School of Oriental and African Studies in London, written as a part-time job to his real job, running Ethiopian investment policy. And in the position that he's in, he will certainly give you the most glowing prospectus possible, but at any rate, he'll do it intelligently and come up with, at any rate, reasonable answers to whatever queries you may have. The lower down you go, on the whole, the less impressive the quality of the leadership. And Ethiopians haven't stayed independent for 2,000 years without acquiring an almost instinctive suspicion of foreigners and what they might be getting up to in their own country, and a tendency to do things by the book, which can get completely infuriating. Understandably, they're suspicious of profiteering, of foreign companies coming in to make a quick buck. They have a word for it in the local jargon, which is rent-seeking. And rent-seeking in Ethiopian language essentially means taking any cash which the government thinks it ought to have instead. the government is actually the supreme rent seeker of the Ethiopian economy. But talk to any local businessman, and a major problem that they have is that inside their company offices they will have tax officials peering down their necks for any source of funds that they can get their mitts on. Foreign business, of course, are in a position to negotiate deals of their own, but it can be difficult to get the government to accept the level of risk factors involved in any major investment in Africa and in Ethiopia too, and therefore to get them to agree to build in the level of return on capital that foreign investors will inevitably need, just as insurance policies against the possibility that things may go wrong. They're apt to talk about the level of return on capital in developed industrial states as though they could expect the same in Ethiopia, and they can't. But the more basic problems that Ethiopia faces, the more basic challenges, if you like, are really political rather than directly economic, and they're both domestic and regional. To take the regional ones first, as I've mentioned, Ethiopia lives in a very rough neighbourhood indeed. South-central Somalia there and southern Sudan there are the most comprehensively collapsed states in the world. And if anyone, probably from an aid agency, tells you about the wonderful progress being made to rebuild the Somali state, don't believe the word of it. The whole thing is chimerical. They have foreign troops and foreign money in there, and so long as those are there, then Somalis will turn up, take the money, and use the troops to enable them to keep it. Virtually everyone in what passes for the Somali federal government is actually a US or other foreign passport holder. And they're there because the money's there, and the moment the security gives out, they'll take the money back home to Minnesota, where for some bizarre reason an amazingly high proportion of American Somalis live. No one yet is even talking seriously about resolving the critical problems of South Sudan, still I think the world's newest state and its most immediately collapsed one. Actually, those two states don't make a huge amount of difference to Ethiopia, which is pretty much insulated from them. The Ethiopians have a pretty efficient army, which is actually encamped all the way along the Somali border and some way into Somalia at that. They keep a very close eye on what's going on in South Sudan. The states that really matter to them are the states that give them access to the sea. And as you can see, Djibouti there is the virtually sole Ethiopian outlet to the sea, which gives it an enormous importance. In some ways it gives the Djibouti government a considerable amount of leverage, but in practice not much, because Djibouti is much more dependent on Ethiopia than Ethiopia is on Djibouti. And if the Djiboutians were to do anything serious to cut off the Ethiopian trade, you can be pretty sure the Ethiopian army would be in there like a shot. They don't. They maintain very close and friendly relations with Ethiopia. But even with the new railway line, which should make a massive difference to inland communications, the port, which has had a huge amount of investment, is run by Dubai Ports World on a contract basis, and they seem to have done a pretty efficient job. But the sheer quantity of shipping waiting to offload in Djibouti is now creating, I'm told, significant bottlenecks. But both for that and for broader reasons of spreading their risks, the Ethiopians are very keen to look for alternative outlets. The obvious ones would be the Eritrean ports of Assab there and Massawa up there, Ethiopia's historic outlets to the sea, which are completely blocked because of an ongoing conflict between the governments of Ethiopia and Eritrea, which controls the whole of the coastline, over the demarcation of their boundary, about which they fought a vicious war between 1998 and 2000, which still hasn't been resolved. So they're hoping, at any rate, for a change of regime in Asmara, the Eritrean capital, which might lead to those ports being opened. The other one they're looking at is Berbera in what's called here Somalia, but is actually Somaliland, which 25 years ago declared itself independent from Somalia, down in Mogadishu to the south, and for 25 years has existed in practice as an independent state, which no one has yet recognised. It has this sort of bizarre international non-status. But a port in Berbera would make a lot of sense, and I'm told that Dubai Ports World is now conducting a feasibility study on that. The area they're looking at is actually, Berbera Port, I'm told, is just too shallow draft for the vessels you'd need. I was down there last year walking along the quayside. All but one of the ships anchored against the quayside were made of wood. Quite amazing. I just didn't realise there were vessels plying the world's oceans made of wood. There was one absolutely wonderful Indian ship, just gleaming with polished teak, something right out of the 19th century. But draft is the key question there, and they're looking for somewhere a bit further along where they have the depth. But, of course, building a new port is itself a major enterprise. You may have heard, too, of a port being proposed on the Kenyan coast, inland from Lamu, down about there. LAPSET is called the Lamu Port South Sudan Ethiopia Transport Corridor, which is supposed to go from Kenya on the coast there, with one line going up into South Sudan, road, rail and oil pipeline, and another one going up into southern Ethiopia. That one, I have to say, looks very speculative indeed to me. Don't rely on it an inch. South Sudan, of course, is a complete mess and shows no sign of getting out of its mess. South Sudanese oil, which was due to provide a lot of the money for it, is running out. They only have a pretty short stock that they've run down in a very short period. And even if you crack that one, the Somali inhabited territories of Ethiopia, which roughly speaking cover that area, create an insecure zone across the hinterland immediately inland from the port. And the amount of money it would require is vast, so I'd count that one out. But other ports in the region are much more viable. That takes us back to the big one. How are we doing for time? How do you know? 5 minutes. That is political stability in Ethiopia itself. Ethiopia is a large country with a population, as I said, probably now of over 100 million. It's a complex and diverse one, and historically has been very difficult to govern. The regime that holds power, that came to power in 1991, is called cumbersomely the Ethiopian People's Democratic Revolutionary Front, which is itself a composite of parties, each of which is based on a particular ethnic group. Never mention the word tribe in Ethiopia. Tribes don't exist. They always talk about nationalities, which actually comes straight out of the Marxist-Leninist phrase book. The Tigrais, who came in 1991, and for long at any rate, had a disproportionate influence in the government, account for less than 10% of the total population of the country, which is a very narrow base to govern on. The major group, the Oromo, occupy the area around Addis Ababa, out to the Sudanese border, virtually down to the Kenyan border, and again close to the Somali border, are about 35%. The Amhara, who have historically been the major ruling group in Ethiopia, up in the mountains to the north there, are about 25%. Nearly 10% Somalis, and that leaves 20% of odds and sods. One very important moment was that when the Prime Minister, and Ethiopia is rare among African states, the big man is the Prime Minister. He runs the government. The President is just an official flag waver and cutter of ribbons on buildings and that kind of stuff. But when Meles died, he was succeeded peacefully, constitutionally, by his deputy, a man called Hailemariam Desalegn, who is a complete outsider in Ethiopian politics. He comes from, if you see the place Sodo there, we're way down in the southwest. If you'd asked me 25 years ago whether a lighter from Sodo could ever become the real leader of Ethiopia, I would have said, you're joking. It never happened. These are backwoods guys. Still more remarkably, Haile Mariam is a Protestant Christian, a Pentecostalist, in a country which has historically been ruled only by Orthodox Christians. And the Ethiopian Orthodox Church goes back a very, very long way indeed. Ethiopia was Christianized in about the 3rd century, about 200 or 300 years before St. Augustine landed in Kent. And that has been the historic ruling church of the country. So it's a credit to Ethiopia in many ways that they can have a leader that comes from outside the system. The problem, of course, is that having a leader coming from the outside means someone who is internally less powerful. When I was in Ethiopia just under a year ago, I spent 2 hours in one-to-one conversation with the Prime Minister. Really excellent guy, very impressive, quiet, extremely intelligent, very well informed, very rare indeed amongst African leaders in that you can just ask him straight questions across the table and he can give you straight answers back. Usually these guys are so pompous and so full of their own importance that they'll only blather away on sort of meaningless generalities. Haile Mariam is on the ball, no question indeed. But coming in as an outsider with, astonishingly, in regimes that descend from liberation movements, normally speaking, liberation credentials, as they're called, having been a key man in the liberation struggle, are the essential requirement for becoming a leader. Haile Mariam has none of that at all. He was studying engineering at a college in Finland, I think it was, when the regime came to power. Never seen a gun in his life, virtually. And that has obliged him to have a much more consensual system of government than his predecessor. Now, in many ways, that's a very good thing. The bane of African governments has been one-man government, where the leader does everything, and if the leader goes, you don't have the first idea what's going to happen, and if the leader changes his policy, you're stuck with it. And in Ethiopia, at least throughout the higher reaches of government, there is a real commitment to the developmental project. But the problem is that it's slower to reach decisions, and come a crisis, a collective leadership is going to be much less well adapted to dealing with it than a person, an individual, especially a really smart individual. And over the last year or so, there's been a whole series of riots and demonstrations, especially in the Oromo region, which is critical. It's not only the region in which Addis Ababa, as a kind of district of Colombia, is nested. The population of Addis Ababa is about 2/3 Amhara, but it's within Oromia, but also the line of rail down to the coast, which is the core corridor for Ethiopia's economic development. Almost all of that runs through Oromo territory. So problems there are serious ones. Ever since the current government came to power 25 years ago, Oromo have had a sense of being left out of it. And in some ways, you might have expected that the fact that their region has been the fastest growing economically in Ethiopia might have led them to support the government. But in practice, rapid economic development creates a lot of problems of its own, especially problems of inequality. Some people get rich, other people stay where they were before, or may even get poorer. And a key problem there has been land. That farmland, for instance, that is suddenly taken over by a factory has a massive instant increase in value. And that's exactly the kind of thing that gives rise to issues of corruption, which historically Ethiopia has been very free of for an African state, but which is becoming a significantly worse problem than it was before. When the government made a proposal for an Addis Ababa master plan, and Addis Ababa has just been expanding like crazy, it made a lot of sense to bring an increased area into Addis Ababa to take advantage of city services and things like that. But the riots from the people in the Oromo region, whom that land would have been taken away from, were such that the government had to back down. Now, Ethiopian governments have enormous problems in dealing with opposition. Their instinctive reaction is just to hammer it. And the present government has certainly got the capacity in terms of force to do that.
The problem is that in an increasingly sophisticated, increasingly developed, increasingly educated society, that just doesn't work the way that it did. The latest problem is just a week or so ago, where there was a big Oromo traditional gathering, a place called Bishoftu, just south of Addis Ababa, which got out of hand. The police started firing tear gas and shooting over the heads of the crowd. They didn't actually shoot into the crowd, but the resulting stampede led to something getting on for 100 people getting killed. Top people in the government are critically aware of the need to develop improved mechanisms for representation and accountability. I don't regard the government as immediately threatened, but certainly in the not too long term, there is going to have to be some major political reform in Ethiopia to enable them to maintain the extraordinarily successful programme of economic development that they've had so far. So let me leave it there. And how long does that leave for questions? And I'm happy to stay if any of you have got time. You'll probably all have to shoot off pretty much on the dot of the end. But if anyone wants to stay behind, I'll be happy to talk.